Of course, you chose to believe the sweet little legend about Nero, the poor 16-year-old youth who entered history as a brilliant young ruler, caring for the people, lowering taxes, arranging festivals, and, for appearances, composing harmless little songs in the Forum. But let's stop chewing on this syrupy noodle already and admit that, in reality, the start of this so-called Golden Age was nothing more than a brightly wrapped stage set for a very dark production where the main actor was a young man unable to balance childish ambitions with the taste of absolute power, gradually turning into a dangerous paranoiac. His much-praised tax reductions were nothing more than a PR stunt, like today's political shows that lure the public with the first cheap trinkets, shiny coins tossed into the crowd, only for the treasury to end up empty, followed, of course, by new levies on the wealthy dressed up as necessary reforms. But never mind that. The important thing was that the crowd roared with delight, intoxicated by the spectacle, blinded by pageantry. All those theatrical appearances by the emperor himself as an actor on stage, just a diversionary tactic, an ancient Instagram feed, where the main goal was to feed the people carefully staged images so they wouldn't hear the grinding gears of palace intrigue behind the velvet curtains. Oh yes, in the beginning everyone sighed. Here he is, our new Apollo in a toga, harmony and mercy in flesh and blood, a man who could strum a lyre, recite poetry, and pretend to listen to petitions from the masses. But the truth, the one the marble inscriptions won't tell you, is that even then, beneath that sugary glaze of the Golden Age, hid a poisonous drop of self-satisfaction and hypersensitivity that would chill anyone daring to say no to him. 16-year-old Nero was like a grown-up preschooler handed a nuclear button and allowed to play King of the Hill with the most expensive toy soldiers in the world, and naturally, he decided the game would never end. Sure, you'll all keep repeating that his first years were wonderful, but are you sure? Or was it just that no one yet dared to check what was really going on in the inner chambers of the young idol, where any criticism equaled treason, and every act, however mundane, was filtered through the lens of a crowned teenager's whims? It was in this early pseudo-virtue that the poison settled, the same poison that would later spill over the whole empire. Because if you can rule the entire world and at the same time star in your own endless performances, then why bother learning anything except how to inflate your own ego? He didn't just want the people's approval. He wanted them to adore him the way he adored himself, without conditions, without the right to object, without the option to ever look away. Even the Senate learned to treat him not as a ruler to be advised, but as a living statue to be worshipped, nodding in unison like well-trained marionettes whenever he glanced their way. And perhaps the most absurd part is that historians still manage to write about the bright beginning of Nero's reign, as if lowering taxes and tossing a couple of free spectacles into the calendar could somehow rewrite the genetic code of power, a code that will always mutate into cruelty in the hands of someone incapable of drawing a line between where the people's interest begins and where it ends. In this case, the first act of Nero's reign wasn't an era of mercy at all. It was a slow, self-indulgent promenade toward an unfolding nightmare, an imperial drama in which every scene was designed to flatter its star, every character was cast to support his illusions, and the audience, Rome itself, was kept too entertained to notice the walls of the theater closing in. And when the curtain finally began to fall, it wasn't because the play had reached a noble conclusion, it was because the actor had mistaken the empire for his personal stage, and the audience had grown tired of applauding. Of course, everyone loves to tell the little fairy tale about the great handsome emperor who was supposedly the victim of his own passions, and how the moment of Poppeia's death was nothing more than an uncontrollable outburst of love mixed with grief. Poor Nero, they say, loved his wife so much that in blind rage he struck her down. Ah, what a tragedy, what Shakespearean drama. But no, let's skip the sentimental gloss, because what happened that summer looks far more like a neatly staged act by a self-satisfied despot who wasn't used to hearing no, and, for the first time, faced a woman who refused to stay silent. Poppaea was no spineless doll, as she sometimes painted for narrative convenience. She was witty, ambitious, politically astute, and certainly not prepared to tolerate the whims of a toga-wrapped adolescent inflated by his own sense of grandeur. This pushed Nero to find new methods of control, cutting her off from friends, surrounding her with flatterers, suffocating her freedom of movement, until one day this so-called love materialized as a kick to the stomach. Historians still dither over the versions. Some say he returned from the races and erupted over her criticism. Others that she dared to point out the emperor cared more about stagecraft than the fate of the state. But why even doubt the motive when all his prior behavior was a ready-made handbook on tyranny? When absolute power lives inside you without limits, striking someone is just another way to shut them up. And it was hardly some spontaneous fling of a cloak in her direction, more likely the inevitable finale of a relationship where every breath was monitored, every step tracked, every small detail used as a loyalty test. The most absurd part is how quickly he switched from violence to theatrical hysteria, weeping, kissing her cold body, threatening the doctors, crying into a pillow, talking to the dead woman as if all that could somehow erase the bruises on her stomach. This performance wasn't for her, she couldn't see it, but for the audience, who were supposed to witness a broken emperor and forever pity him, forgetting that it was his hands that pushed this scene into reality. And for Nero, it became the perfect excuse to once again seize the public stage. Instead of shame, he built a cult, sealed her in a lavish tomb, forbade anyone from speaking of the widow in the past tense, and exiled those who dared suggest he move on, as if the goal was not reverence, but keeping the entire world under a single spell. Poppaea lives, so long as he could command the crowd of his subjects. The empire would keep dancing to the melody of his grief. And here's the real irony. This carefully manufactured mourning wasn't even about Poppaea. It was about Nero's own reflection in the eyes of the people. By turning himself into the tragic widower-in-chief, he managed to reframe an act of sheer brutality as a chapter of epic romance gone wrong, ensuring that even his crime became another scene in his lifelong drama of self-worship. Every wreath laid at her tomb, every tear shed in public was a mirror angled to catch his profile. Those who refused to play along were not just political enemies, they were narrative hazards, spoilers in the script of his imagined immortality. And like any bad playwright who confuses applause with absolution, he doubled down, expanding the cult, commissioning statues, and ensuring that the woman he had silenced in life would forever speak only through words he put in her mouth. The empire mourned because it was told to mourn, and the greatest tragedy was not Poppaea's death. It was how easily her death was rewritten into propaganda, another jewel in the crown of a man who had learned that power is never so secure as when it hides behind the mask of grief. Let's blow apart the cozy myth of the romantic double and look at the dirty mechanics of power. After Poppaea's death, Nero didn't need a consoling phantom, he needed an instrument, cheap, obedient, and spectacular. And here's where a young man named Sporus gets dragged onto the stage, raised in the imperial household, not quite a slave, but hardly free. Perfect intermediate stock for court experiments. He wasn't discovered for brains or achievements. His facial features just dangerously matched the portraits of the late empress. And in the empire, coincidences have a way of becoming sentences. In the chamber where the lamps dim and whims grow, the showman's logic kicks in. If a thing looks similar, it can be adjusted to fit the format. Doctors, the very ones who swear to heal, become carpenters of someone else's identity, measuring, cutting, binding, dulling pain with herbs and promises of favor. No one asks whether Sporus wants to live without his own future. In this performance, his voice is appointed as background noise. And don't whisper about an age of gestures as if we're staring at a tragedy of feelings. This is an industrial process for manufacturing a convenient icon. Today, oblivion; tomorrow, anesthetic; the day after, a new role, a new hairstyle, a new walk. The preparation rooms aren't boudoirs, they're workshops where the slope of a shoulder is measured to the millimeter, where cosmetics correct shadows, where hairstyling becomes a form of discipline. Tutors explain how to smile with eyelids instead of teeth, how to sit without taking up space, how to speak so that words oblige no one to anything. In the state coffers, fabrics, jewelry, amulets flow. The budget is called love, but the expenses are filed under props for a personal hallucination. Courtiers instantly find the correct angle. Everyone sees what the master wants them to see, because otherwise he'll see their heads on the stairs. Guards are labeled protectors of propriety, servants are witnesses of a miracle, and Sporus is Sabina. So it's easier to forget that between a name and a person, the distance can equal a life. Watch how easily the gears lock together. The young man is paraded in sedan chairs, trained to accept alien scents, alien hands, alien attention, and the louder the orchestra of flatterers plays, the quieter his own thoughts become. There's no magic of love here. There's the cold accounting of propaganda. The emperor needs a living souvenir, a museum exhibit still breathing, proof that he's stronger than death because he can sculpt from pain a copy and make everyone worship it. Sporus is taught to remember what he never lived and forget what he did. In exchange, they promise safety, but deliver a schedule of silences and bows. The courtly public, a masked chorus, opens its programs. Today, the return of the goddess. Tomorrow, the triumph of virtue. The day after, the kiss behind the veils. Those who love stories about benevolent healers should check the warehouse records. Bandages, salves, perfumes, ribbons, beads, silks, each a line item glued to someone else's skin. Then, of course, a wedding, because without a seal, fiction won't run. The emperor leads the bride under the chorus of feral pastorals, drapes yesterday's boy in rings like a garland of excuses. Thin gold chains cut into the wrists like the lines of a decree. To be considered authentic until further notice. Why is everyone so pleased? Because the courtly paradise runs on one simple rule. If the truth ruins the decor, the truth is at fault. And the more lavish the light-drenched processions, the deeper sink into the carpets those who remember real names. Any attempt to say, "My name is Sporus," becomes an accusation of ingratitude, and any silence becomes proof of the authenticity of Sabina. This is the main trap. They strip you of the nominative case, and you become an accessory to someone's grief. Ah, how sweet, the uninitiated reader might say. The emperor, grieving the loss of his beloved woman, tries to preserve her image. Sweet? Are you serious? Let's strip away the romantic haze and look at what this operation of the century really was. This isn't a scene from a love tragedy. It's a meticulously planned demonstration of power, where one man decided he was not just above the law, but above nature itself. The script is simple and revolting. Nero spots a teenager whose cheekbones and gaze suspiciously resemble the late Poppaea, and instead of saying, "looks like her," and moving on, he decides to play God sculptor. Of course, the game is at someone else's expense and on someone else's body. It all starts with summoning the doctors. Yes, those same men who swore to heal, not harm. Their mission now? To neatly cut away not only part of Sporus's body, but also his entire future as a man. The imperial chambers are quickly turned into an operating room, where, instead of cleanliness, there's pomp. Instead of sterility, expensive incense to mask the scent of blood. Nobody asks the teenager if he wants to be part of this circus, and why would they? His voice has long since been irrelevant in the market of imperial decisions. The procedure is painful, dangerous, with a high mortality rate. But who cares about statistics when, at the end of the tunnel, Nero sees a mirage? Poppaea reborn in a new wrapper. Surviving the operation earns Sporus a bonus Empress starter pack, private quarters, a wardrobe, elaborate hairstyles, makeup lessons, and training in the walk, smiles, and proper gestures. This isn't just erasing his personality, it's methodically scraping it off, layer by layer, like old paint from a statue, to apply a new facade. They show him how to look at guests, restrained yet inviting, how to lift a wine cup so the wrist looks delicate, how to sit so the dress falls correctly. Voice lessons are a separate torture. Sporus is drilled to speak higher, softer, always smiling when saying yes. Incidentally, no is never taught. It's not on the syllabus. State funds are spent on this, conveniently labeled as court expenses. Jewelers receive commissions for rings and necklaces once worn by Poppaea, now turned into golden shackles. Fabrics from distant provinces arrive to cover a body that no longer belongs to itself, all of it wrapped in the syrupy sauce of reviving lost love. When Sporus has mastered the mechanical repetition of the required moves, he is brought into the spotlight. He's no longer a youth with a past. He's Sabina, resurrected and idealized, a walking set piece for the emperor's fantasy. And the vilest part of this spectacle? How quickly everyone around adapts to their roles, senators smiling, servants whispering, and the crowd below debating whether the goddess has returned. The truth is plain and ugly. This was never a romantic cult of memory, but political and psychological conditioning of a living human being. Sporus was turned into a symbol because symbols are easier to control. A symbol has no desires of its own, only functions. And unlike a marble statue, it can walk, bow, smile, and say, "Yes, my lord." So if anyone ever tries to sell you this story as a touching legend of great love, remember, behind every neatly arranged lock of hair, here is the same hand that held the knife. And behind every gentle smile is a scream that simply wasn't permitted to be heard. History knows so well how to wrap filth in velvet. In textbooks, this is usually called Nero's eccentric marriage or an unusual page of court life. But let's stop playing with window displays and pull this out from behind the glass. This is not some touching story of mad love. It's the final act of a multi-stage training where a living person became a puppet in someone else's show. Sporus, a teenager who was first castrated, then stripped of identity, and now was to be legitimized as the emperor's wife, so the world would finally believe. Poppaea had returned. The Roman court is a theater, but a special kind. There are no spectators, because everyone is acting a role. And here, a solemn ceremony, noise, gold, scents, fabric trailing over marble. At the center, the emperor in the image of a loving husband, and next to him Sabina in a woman's toga, eyes lowered, with a smile that isn't born in the soul, but drilled into the face on command. All of this to cement in the minds of the subjects a myth: the emperor can conquer death, bring back the beloved, and place her beside him for all to see. Behind this ceremony lies cold calculation. This isn't about feelings, it's about power and image. When the emperor has a copy of his dead wife, he shows that not only the state, but the very fabric of reality is under his control. Don't like that someone died? Make a new one. Don't like that he was a man? Rewrite his biography. The law of Rome? A trifle, if you can rewrite even the laws of nature. Senators stand and applaud because they know their voices stopped mattering long ago. The crowd gathers at the foot of the stairs, whispering. Some believe in the miracle, others quietly call the emperor mad, but no one dares to say it aloud. Every participant in the show knows how well they play their role may decide whether they live. Sporus in this script is like a precious vase pulled from a cellar, washed, repainted, and now carried from hall to hall. He has no right to move aside, no right to speak a word not in the script. His life is now a sequence of poses, smiles, and appearances on schedule. For every wrong gesture, the price could be fatal. And so, with the sweet scent of incense in the air and the choir of trumpets blaring, the emperor slips a ring onto the bride's finger. It gleams like a symbol of love, but in reality, it is a seal of ownership. In the eyes of the crowd, a miracle. In Sporus's eyes, a cage merely gilded. And the most cynical thing about this story is how easily all of Rome agrees to play along with the lie. Courtiers invent 1,000 justifications. It's in Poppaea's memory. It will strengthen the emperor's power. It is the will of the gods. The truth is simple. It is the will of one man who imagined that everything around him is his stage and all people are props. Thus ends Sporus's transformation from a free being into an empress in a woman's toga, from a person into decoration. And if you ever hear this story told in gentle tones, remember, behind every ribbon on his dress, behind every sparkle of the stone in the ring, there is blood, pain, and silence that have been made part of the ceremony. Everyone loves to whisper this sticky story about how, in the year 67 AD, Nero, the Roman emperor with a god complex and a taste for psychological terror, staged the wedding of the century with his favorite Sporus, whom he had already remade into a copy of his dead wife. Historians usually present this as a strange but almost theatrical whim, as if the emperor was just bored and decided to invent himself a bride out of a boy. But without the rose-tinted glasses, this was not a harmless farce. It was a meticulously planned demonstration of power where control came first and love didn't even make the guest list. Picture a hall bathed in the light of hundreds of oil lamps, marble columns draped with fabrics as if it were a festival of Venus, servants in silk, musicians tuning their instruments, courtiers clinging to the walls pretending joy. But at the center, not a gentle bride, but Sporus, a boy who had been broken for months into the emperor's ideal. His walk no longer belonged to him. Each step was the result of hundreds of hours of rehearsal under instructors who ensured he placed his foot womanly and held his chin at the prescribed angle. By this point, Sporus's voice no longer sounded as it once had. It had been drilled into a melodic, soft tone with which he now recited his vows, though his eyes were empty. This was no marriage. It was the final sealing of the fact that he had become a symbol, a decoration, an object of Nero's personal cult. Nero, of course, reveled in every detail. Lavish jewelry, pieces once worn by Poppaea, now gleamed on Sporus's neck and arms. Even the dress, custom-made from rare Eastern fabrics, was a replica of an outfit Poppaea had once worn to a celebration, all to make sure the guests never forgot exactly who they were supposed to be seeing in this boy. And the guests saw, or rather, pretended to see. No one dared to question the naturalness of this wedding. Laughter, admiring exclamations, toasts, it was all acting, because the real emotion hanging in the air was a mix of fear and disgust. Rome knew those who didn't support the spectacle risked ending up in the Colosseum as free entertainment for the crowd. The ceremony followed every canon, exchange of vows, symbolic gifts, the union sealed with official documents. Legally, it all looked as if Nero had married a woman named Sabina. But it was a fiction, and everyone knew it, a fiction elevated to the status of state reality. From that day forward, Sporus lived as the empress. He had his own staff of servants, private quarters, and a separate entrance to the imperial gardens. At official receptions, he sat beside Nero, listened to the flattering speeches of senators, nodded, smiled, and played the role that was burning him from the inside. Every movement, every gesture was part of the grand set piece called Sabina. But in this wedding lay the whole truth about Nero. He didn't just want love. He didn't just want intimacy. He wanted complete power over what a person was, over their very essence. He could take a youth, strip him of his name, his body, his voice, his past, and make all of Rome pretend this was a great love story. This was not a union. It was a public declaration. I can rewrite reality, and you will live in it. So when you hear about Nero's wedding as the quirky folly of a strange tyrant, remember, this was neither an anecdote nor a romantic tragedy. It was a cold, calculated act of power where a human life became nothing more than a prop, and the laughter of the guests was the soundtrack to one of the most exquisite humiliations in history. Everyone loves to tell the sugary little legend about how poor young Sporus, dressed in silk and gold, lived in luxury at Nero's court, as if we're watching an ancient Roman melodrama. But let's strip all the gilding off this picture and see what's inside. This is not the story of a luxurious life. It's the story of a perfectly staged play in which the actor was given only one role, with no right to rewrite the script, and the director was a man with unlimited power and a pathological imagination. And this play ran every day, without intermissions, without rest, without any exit backstage. After doctors, on Nero's orders, turned Sporus into Sabina, the most sophisticated torture began. Not knives, not chains, but the constant methodical killing of his own self. His personality wasn't destroyed all at once. No, that would have been too crude. It was slowly scraped away, like old paint from marble, layer by layer. Every morning began with the ritual of transformation. Servants brought in caskets of jewelry, necklaces once worn by Poppaea, dresses tailored to her measurements, sandals with straps, cosmetic sets with Eastern perfumes. All so that when he looked into the mirror, he wouldn't see himself, but the ghost of a woman he had never even known alive. And the mirror, by the way, was a torture device of its own. Romans loved large bronze mirrors, and Sporus's chambers had enough of them for him to see Sabina from every angle. No glance, even an accidental one, allowed him to see his real self. Everything around him was a set piece, a constant reminder. Your life belongs to someone else's fantasy. Then came the rehearsals. Nero could suddenly, in the middle of dinner, recall some happy moment from his marriage to Poppaea, and Sporus had to react as if he had been there. Not just nod, he had to bring the right smile to his face, squint his eyes just so, as if summoning up a tender scene in his mind's eye. Miss the tone or the pause, and the emperor would be irritated, and an irritated emperor was a threat to one's life. The paradox was that everyone knew it was all theater. Senators, nobles, servants, they all understood that Empress Sabina was a boy who had been forcibly turned into a doll. But the rules of the game demanded that everyone behave as if the lie were real. It was a total conspiracy of silence where the lie became mandatory etiquette. And Sporus was the central exhibit in this performance, the only one not allowed to step out of character even for a second. Yes, he lived in lavish halls, ate from golden dishes, and wore jewelry enough to ransom a small town. But try eating a date when you're being forced to play a woman you are not. And worse, one whose death came at the hands of the man sitting across from you. This glitter and comfort were no gift. They were chains, only made of gold and silk. The most insidious thing was that Nero seemed to start believing the illusion himself. He addressed him as Poppaea, said, "Remember when we," and could spend hours reminiscing about events Sporus had never experienced. And each such memory wasn't just a conversation. It was a loyalty test, an exam where failure could cost your life. In the end, Sporus became a master of lying, not by choice, but by necessity. He learned to anticipate lines like a seasoned actor who knows his partner so well he can catch the slightest change in tone. He was forced to think for Nero, feel for him, be his mirror. But the better he played the role, the more he himself disappeared. This wasn't life in luxury. It was a lifetime theatrical contract signed without consent, in which the penalty for the smallest mistake was death. Every day, every movement, every glance was labor, as heavy as hard labor itself. And when historians dryly write that Sporus lived as empress, they forget to add, the empress in this case was not a person, but a living monument to a dead woman, a monument forbidden to be itself. Historians love to end Sporus' story at the moment when Nero, in 68 AD, plunged a dagger into his own throat. Curtain down, shouts off stage, the play is over. But for Sporus, it was only the beginning. Only now the directors changed faster than the costumes in a cheap production, and the plot grew filthier and more cynical. After the emperor's suicide, the young man, long stripped of his own name, voice, and life, found himself in a strange position. He had become a political trophy. Not a man, not a person, but a prestige object, like a precious vase or a rare slave that proves your status and power. No one asked whether he wanted to be a trophy. He simply passed from one set of hands to another, like a thing to be shown to guests and used for one's pleasure. The first to receive him was Otho. Yes, the same Otho who had once been Nero's friend and even married to Poppaea before the emperor stole her away. Otho had his own unsettled accounts with the memory of Poppaea, and Sporus's presence in his household looked almost like a trophy taunt at the past. For him, Sporus was not a tragedy, but a convenient living relic to display at court, a reminder of his ties to the previous dynasty. The irony was that, under these new circumstances, Sporus's life changed in no real way. Same role, same masquerade, same silks, only the applause now came from different mouths. But Otho did not stay long on the Roman throne. Vitellius arrived, and here the true nightmare began. If Nero had been theatrically obsessive and controlling, Vitellius was vulgar and cynical. He didn't just use Sporus as an empress, he turned him into the target of public humiliation. Scenes of marriage to Nero were now staged as farce, with lewd jokes, crude remarks, and the laughter of the crowd. And Sporus was once again forced to perform, because the alternative in Rome at that time was always the same: death, and not a quick one. The Romans, weary of dynastic intrigues, saw this as mere entertainment. For them, Sporus was no longer a tragic figure, but a caricature. His walk, his gestures, his voice, everything once polished to perfection, was now fodder for mockery. And every laugh in the audience, every approving cheer, was a blow to whatever remained of his identity. Vitellius's particular cruelty lay in the fact that, unlike Nero, he did not believe in the illusion. To him, Sporus was not a woman, not Sabina, but a boy who could be put in a dress and forced to mimic feelings he did not have. This was not the worship of an image, but the deliberate mocking of a man trapped in that image. And in this endless parade of masters, grand halls, and public humiliations, Sporus finally understood. There would be no end to it. Under Nero, he had at least been part of a carefully constructed myth, one that sometimes allowed him to hide behind the role. Under Vitellius, the role became an open wound, torn, twisted, and displayed until nothing inside was left but emptiness. Outwardly, everything looked proper: fine fabrics, banquets, jewels, attentive servants. But behind the tinsel was constant threat. Every new owner could decide that Sporus was no longer useful. Any drunken guest could take liberties, knowing that no one would be punished for insulting this trophy. In the end, the pressure became unbearable. Sporus, a man who had been stripped first of his body, then his name, then his voice, and finally his very self, realized that the only way to regain even a shred of freedom was to leave the stage entirely. And he made his choice. Historians write laconically, "Most likely, Sporus committed suicide," but behind this dry phrase lies the horror of his final months. He had been dying since Nero's reign, but physically departed only when he knew he would never be himself again. His life after the emperor's death was not a new chapter, but the epilogue to a tragedy, one even darker than the tragedy itself. Historians love to present this story in a dry and polished manner. A tragic fate of a young man named Sporus ended in suicide to avoid disgrace. It sounds almost noble, like an epitaph worthy of a Roman mausoleum. But in reality, everything was much dirtier, meaner, and more theatrical, and there was nothing noble about it. This was not the tragic choice of a free man, but the final act of a years-long play where the actor was never asked if he wanted to participate. By the time Vitellius sat on the throne, Sporus had long since become a walking symbol of humiliation, a political souvenir that various rulers saw as a convenient tool for their small and large intrigues. But Vitellius, unlike his predecessors, did not bother with maintaining an illusion. He didn't want Empress Sabina floating gracefully in silks. He wanted a spectacle, one so memorable that Rome would not remember him as just another faceless usurper, but as an emperor who knew how to entertain the masses. The plan was simple: take Sporus and display him in the Colosseum in a carefully staged scene of an infernal wedding, a parody of his marriage to Nero. The idea was to dress him in the same attire, recreate the processions, the servants, the incense, and end the performance with a bloody farce. Some accounts suggest that Sporus was to be married to a wild beast, perhaps a massive bull, as was sometimes done in especially sadistic shows. The crowd would roar with delight as the former imperial favorite became part of a vulgar and brutal mockery. For Vitellius, this was more than entertainment. It was a political statement to show that the era of Nero and his eccentricities was over, and all that remained of it was a pathetic, broken man paraded for ridicule. In doing so, he mocked the former emperor, pleased the masses, and demonstrated his absolute power over the fates of those who had once been celebrated as royalty. For Sporus, it was the end of any illusion. He had endured everything, from forced castration and transformation into a bride, to public banquets and whispers behind his back. Yet, even under those conditions, there remained a tiny zone of personal space, what happened behind the curtains, away from the public gaze. Now Vitellius was going to take even that last fragment away. Imagine, you are 20 years old, yet already tired of living as though you were 100. Every gesture, every glance is a role you play from someone else's script. Your name has been forgotten, your voice belongs to others, your body is the property of the state. And now you are told that in a few days you will be dressed like a puppet and displayed before tens of thousands of eyes so that your final act becomes a joke retold for generations. It was not a choice between life and death, It was a choice between death on his own terms and death as part of a barbaric show. Sporus understood. Stepping into the arena meant dying in screams, laughter, and spit, and then becoming a cheap anecdote in tawdry chronicles. Leaving by his own hand meant depriving the crowd of that pleasure. Official sources are terse. Most likely he committed suicide. But behind that phrase was cold, deliberate resolve. This was perhaps the first and last moment in his adult life when he acted by his own will. The irony was that only death could restore his control over his fate. Vitellius was furious, of course, deprived of the grand finale he had counted on. The crowd was left without its entertainment, but in a sense, Sporus had won. He refused to be part of their script, denying them the spectacle they had expected. He vanished, leaving an empty space in the arena and a story that would later be retold sometimes as a tragedy, sometimes as a farce. Historians love to package fates into neat formulas. A tragic story, a testament to the morals of the era, an example of despotism. But the story of Sporus is too sharp to remain inside the dry frame of an encyclopedia. It is not just an anecdote about Nero's whims or a curiosity about an unusual imperial wedding. It is a surgically precise illustration of how absolute power can grind a human being into dust, turning them from subject into object, from person into a prop for someone else's fantasies. The Fate of Sporus is a textbook on the mechanics of humiliation. First, he was deprived of his gender, not for medical reasons, not to save his life, but for the sake of a grotesque spectacle in which he was to portray the deceased wife of the emperor. Then came years of living in a constant performance, when every movement, glance, and smile were not his own, but dictated by the role. Not only his body, but his name, voice, and even memory were rewritten according to a script he never authored. And every time he stumbled or faltered, the court would simply correct him, not as one corrects a human, but as one repairs a broken stage prop. The most frightening part is that the performance continued despite changes on the throne. Nero, Otho, Vitellius, each had their own goals, but none of them saw a human in Sporus. For one, he was a replacement for a dead wife. For another, a political trophy. For the third, a tool of public humiliation. The machinery of the state, fused with the personal whims of rulers, turned him into something between an expensive vase and a living caricature. He was passed along like a piece of furniture, without consent, without agency, without even the dignity of being forgotten. His life became a chain of cages, each with a new lock but the same absence of a key. And this is precisely where his historical significance lies. Sporus is not about peculiar ancient Roman morals, but about an eternal mechanism in which power, unchecked, begins to amuse itself with the lives of its subjects. There is no difference between eras and nations here. Costumes, sets, and technologies change, but the essence remains. Today, no one is executed in the Colosseum, but the transformation of a person into an image for political gain or mass entertainment is still a familiar practice. Every age finds its own Colosseum, now built of cameras, headlines, and public feeds, where the crowd still demands blood, even if it is symbolic. And in those digital arenas, applause is replaced with likes, and the jeering crowd hides behind anonymity. But the cruelty is the same. The death of Sporus was a rare, almost impossible gesture in that system. It was not a romantic act or a tragic sacrifice for something greater. It was a quiet, grim, but entirely conscious refusal to be part of someone else's performance. He took away from the crowd and the authorities what they wanted most, the final spectacle. His departure became a personal victory precisely because it deprived them of closure. And in that refusal, there was a kind of rebellion, not loud, not bloody, but devastating in its denial of the script written for him. The story of Sporus is a mirror that is uncomfortable to look into, because in it we see not only the cruelties of Rome, but also today's forms of using people as symbols, memes, and faces of ideas. He is a reminder that power is always tempted to turn a person into a tool, and society is always ready to watch it as entertainment. That readiness, that hunger for spectacle, is what allows cruelty to wear the mask of art, politics, or tradition without shame. It is what ensures that there will always be an audience for humiliation, as long as the stage is well lit and the actors have no choice. And perhaps the most paradoxical part of his legacy is that it lives on in contradiction. His identity was destroyed during his life, but the very fact of that destruction made him a historical figure. Had he remained an anonymous slave, he would have been forgotten.